Well, welcome to this webinar, which is the 13th under the auspices of the Populism and Constitutional Democracy Project, which is conducted by Adam Czarnota, Wojciech Sadurski, and me, Martin Krieger. The project is supported by the Australian Research Council, and in these webinars, held in cooperation with the Central European University's Democracy Institute's Rule of Law program, we discuss the most important recent books dealing with contemporary populism, and we've been lucky to be able to discuss them with their authors. The webinars are recorded, and you can access any of the previous 12 through the project's website, globalconpop, all one word, globalconpop.blog, or on YouTube. You'll be notified when this one is edited and when it appears online. The title of the book that we will discuss today is Democracy Unmoored. The subtitle, also important for reasons which we'll return to, is Populism and the Corruption, I emphasize that word, of Popular Sovereignty. It's published this year by Oxford University Press. The author is Samuel Issacharoff, Rice Professor of Constitutional Law at New York University's Law School. Sam is author of an astonishing amount and an astonishing range of influential work in many fields. Most particularly relevant to us are his investigations of the conditions, the character, and the consequences of democracy, and more specifically, on the sources of democratic fragility and vulnerability. And particularly, he brings his experience and his expertise to possible legal and institutional responses to such sources of fragility and vulnerability. That's a concise summary which leaves out a great deal, but it is the stuff that we will be focusing on tonight. Sam's also experienced in the practical intersection of law and democratic politics, having served as a senior legal advisor to the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama. And he has long experience as an appellate advocate in American courts. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, so distinguished all around. And we're grateful that you've given us our time. We're looking forward to talking with you. Sam joins us from Sydney, where he's just arrived, to attend the Comparative Constitutional Studies Conference at the University of New South Wales, and then the International Society of Constitutional Law Conference in Wellington, New Zealand. And in accordance with our only occasionally flouted tradition, he'll be interviewed by the three co-investigators in our project, Adam Czarnota, who is Honorary Associate Professor at University of New South Wales, but more intensely at the moment, Rector of the Riga Graduate School of Law in Latvia. Wojciech Sadurski is Challis Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney and Professor at the Centre for Europe in Warsaw. And me, Martin Krieger, Gordon Samuels Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales and Senior Research Fellow at the Central European University Democracy Institute in Budapest. Adam joins us from Białystok in eastern Poland. Wojciech and I and Sam are all in Sydney. This book, Democracy Unmoored, is a remarkably rich and panoramic discussion of semi-autocratic populism, and in particular of populist regimes rather than populist movements who would like to be in power but aren't yet, of regimes that have come to power in many parts of the world. He himself grew up in Argentina, and he draws on examples from South and North America, where he has spent a great deal of his life, from India, from Turkey, from Central Europe, from South Africa, and more. He offers illumination on what are the characteristic and the distinctive features of this trend, why it's occurring, largely unpredicted and unexpected now, how one might intelligently and fruitfully respond to it, and what are its and our prospects in this increasingly jangled and uncertain world and time. And I'll begin by just asking Sam to outline some of the central themes of the book, perhaps under headings which map but reorder slightly, fundamental headings or basic headings in the book. So what are we talking about? Why is it happening? Why now? How we might respond and where we might be going. So first of all, what? And in particular, or to start with, what are they not? What's distinctive about what's going now? Given that these developments were unpredicted, it's natural to try to understand what you call, Sam, the new world of incipient authoritarianism in terms of autocratic developments we're familiar with. But you think that's a mistake, and you tell us quite a lot about why these movements are distinctive. So could you enlighten us on that?
Sure. First, thanks for having me and for reading my book. One always writes with the expectation that only your mother will read it, and then even she doesn't. About 8 years ago, I published a book called Fragile Democracies. And the thesis of that book was that in the post-1989 wave of democratizations around the world, not just Eastern Europe, but South Africa, Latin America, and so forth, the democracies that emerged were fragile, were weak, because you did not have the institutional foundations well established. You didn't have political parties, you didn't have a mature legislative branch, and their vulnerability was heavily toward executive command, to the one person who could organize the police authority of the state, taking hold and strangling the incipient democratic order. The thesis of that book was that what had emerged as a counterweight, quite unexpectedly, was the newly created constitutional courts that were modeled on the Italian and German post-war forces that could declare the actions of the political branches to be anti-constitutional, anti-democratic. I then started to wonder what happens if these institutions are simply not formed. That is, in the post-1989, what happens if they're not well formed? But what happens in a democratic world if you have retrocession? And in fact, you don't have these institutions not emerging, but you have them being unwound. And to a large extent, this project was a response to a question at a book forum posed by Ira Katz-Nelson on my earlier book, Fragile Democracies. And he said, what is distinctive here? Is it true that there is such a condition as a fragile democracy, or do all democracies have that vulnerability, that kind of genetic predisposition? And if you will, this is Hobbes about democracy being vulnerable to the orators. This is Thucydides about the democratic Athens being vulnerable to the passions of the masses. And this idea that democracy could be unwound if its institutions fail is what's the genesis of this book. So this is a book that begins with the why now question, is that the democratic foundations of the 2 centuries of ascendancy, that is the 19th and 20th centuries, were based upon mass institutions in the society, civil society institution, trade unions, churches, small business associations, which gave rise to political expression. And that integrated social and political unison presented a form of democratic politics heavily focused on legislative activity, heavily focused on political parties having a program that drew from below and that was expressed in the exercise of state authority. So the first big move in the book is to talk about the failings of democratic institutions. I label this the world the populace found. And it's a world in which, in the stable democratic societies, Australia is a little bit of an outlier here, but in stable democratic societies, you've had a retrocession in the standards of living of the laboring classes in the period in which we had massive wealth transfers to China, to the Far East, entirely justifiable. But that period was a period of economic dislocation, the globalization threat, the unwinding of the industrial foundations of the advanced democratic countries. And that vulnerability, combined with certain kinds of state incapacity and the failing of the traditional political parties, I mean, we can get into that later on, that left a moment in which the needs of the large masses of these democratic societies did not have a political expression. And in that moment, you had the beginnings of the current populist movement. So I don't want to go on too long, but that's the general outline.
Okay. So that's the background. That's what this grew out of. But what grew out of it? Because you have some very interesting material on what we might have expected if we were talking about autocratic trends, is different in fundamental ways from what we've got. And what is it that these are not, which we might have expected if we were told 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, let's go back to the 20th century. When democracies were failing, when democratic governments weren't able to deliver, what was the response? The response was a military coup. The response was an ideological movement formed around fascism or around communism. And what we have now is something very different. We have elected officials who have genuine democratic pedigree. I think that the only election of one of these modern autocrats that is possibly contestable as being not a proper outcome was the second election of Chavez in Venezuela. Otherwise, Kaczynski won, Orban won, Modi won, Erdogan prevailed. So these folks come to power and use the power of elected office and the established legal order to begin to unwind the democratic process, their democratic accountability. So it's different than what we've seen in the 20th century, where democracy tended to be overthrown. Now we see instead people with legitimate democratic claims on power using that in a way that is fundamentally anti-liberal, fundamentally anti-competition, and which is the core of modern populism.
So, okay, so what they're not extra legal, they're not in the main, with some exceptions, they're not violent, they don't imprison or kill too many of their opponents. That's what they're not. And what is their MO, modus operandi? What is distinctive and characteristic of the way they go about solidifying their power? And
this is, I think, the most distinctive feature of the book. And there are relatively few people who write on populism who stress this point. Unfortunately, one of them is looking at me on the screen right now, Wojciech. But the main argument here is that the key to populist governance is democratic forms of selection, but without institutional limitations. And so I start from the premise that the key to democracy is two things. One is repeat play, a commitment that everybody's part of the same enterprise, and if I lose today, I can come back and win tomorrow. And the second is that there are constraints, there are limitations on what the majority in power can do. Populist governance, as I define it, rejects both of these premises. Every election is the knife's edge. Every election is the apocalyptic moment. It's us or them. There is no sense of joint enterprise. And they claim that the power of having been the majority, and whether it's majority in a technical sense or a governing plurality under the rules that operate in that particular country, that gives them a complete entitlement to decretal authority. And unfortunately, this is facilitated by the fact that in virtually every democratic country, the legislative branch has largely collapsed. It is no longer a functioning, policy-oriented, debate-centered institution, but rather it is merely a voting of approbation or condemnation of the executive. So it's simply a yes/no that does not serve as a real constraint upon the executive unless there is a division in power at the time between, for example, Democrats and Republicans in the United States or something of that sort. So to my mind, what's distinctive is democracy without institutions. And those include the legislative branch, includes political parties that have a long-term horizon. It includes civil society organizations. And you're absolutely right, Martin, that the characteristic is not extreme violence, although many of these groups are violent. So we should not discount that too readily. They tend not to lock up their opponents, although there are many journalists in prison in Turkey and in Mexico. They tend not to turn on institutions directly. Martin, you have a position at CEU. CEU was never officially removed from Hungary. It was just made to be non-functional because everything that they did was audited by tax authorities, was subject to bureaucratic inquiries, and the use of those kinds of administrative mechanisms to grind down the opposition, to make it impossible for them to function, is distinctive of this populist group. Pinochet did not use the tax authorities to go after his enemies. He had different means. That's not the characteristic of Orban or Kaczynski or Modi.
Sure. But on the other hand, you say that they're anti-institutional. On the other hand, one of the things that you stress equally much is that while they may not want institutions that get in the way, in fact, they certainly don't want that, they're very determined to use institutions in ways that are different from some of their predecessors. So you talk inner legal rather than extra legal means. I wonder if you could expand on that and how that works.
So I give an example at the beginning of the book that about 15 years ago, I was in Venezuela. I was invited to give some talks there, a very complicated environment. And I was taken to meet with about 15 heads of the independent media, television networks, newspapers, and so forth. And I asked a question in this gathering. I said, what is the biggest threat to you from the regime? Now, this is Chavez, who was consolidating power, who was trying to amend the Constitution, who was taking long-standing political power away from the city of Caracas because they had an oppositional government. And they said, biggest problem was being sued for defamation. Now, there's nothing anti-democratic about a defamation suit. The defamation arises from the common law tradition that there have to be boundaries on the kind of insults that can be levied by one citizen against another, or by the state against the citizen. But the state would sponsor defamation suits. And when I asked these journalists how many they had, the ranges began at 50. And when the first journalist said he had 50 lawsuits against him, everybody else broke out laughing. And I interceded. I said, in his defense, I said, what are you people laughing at? Don't you understand how much time and expense it takes to defend 50 lawsuits. I mean, we have Wojciech here who only had 4 and was complaining all around the world.
He does. He's terrible that way.
But by the time I got to the last person in the room, who was the head of the 24-hour news cycle, television, he had over 5,000 defamation lawsuits against them. In Argentina, if you criticize the government and you're a newspaper, they will arrange for a strike so that newsprint is not delivered to you. So these are mechanisms that are not tanks, they are not torture centers, but they work within the law, and they always fall back on whataboutism. That is, when you say you're using this, they say, what, there's no defamation law in Britain? Or when you say, you're using the strike threat to shut down an opposing newspaper. Yes, in anti-democratic countries, they prohibit the right to strike. We encourage the right to strike. And so there's always a sense that it works within some legal framework, except it doesn't.
Yeah. So, I mean, that combination that is so central to your exposition of, on the one hand, hostility to institutions that could get in the way, no middlemen here, and on the other hand, extensive use of law, and we haven't even talked about constitutional law yet. You say, and it's a central theme in your work, is intimately concerned with and productive of corruption. Can you talk a little about how corruption is not just a side issue, but a central, if you like, implication of this way of dealing with things?
When I started doing this research about 15 years ago, in country after country, I kept encountering the question of corruption. And I would discard anything on that immediately, because corruption is, by the simplest definition, is a deterioration of the body. It is something that has compromised the capacity to function of an individual. And I saw it as a one-off question. And then after a while, it was country after country after country. And I started to think more about the conditions under which you get corruption. And the OECD data indicate that the stronger the institutions in a given country, the less likely you are to have pervasive corruption. It's very hard to measure, but there's a pretty strong correlation between the legal and economic and political institution stability and the reports of people who do business in those countries of how easy is it to do business, how much are you shaken down, how much are you likely to encounter corruption. And I went to the developmental economics literature, and they have a kind of one-off discussion that's quite interesting on the conditions under which societies will invest in technology, invest in long-term growth possibilities. And they said it only exists where you have stable political institutions, because otherwise, why would you invest for tomorrow if you can reap the benefits today? And that's sort of a parallel insight. So the way I put this together is that as institutions break down, it became necessary for individuals to get things done on a one-off basis. What our former president of the United States, Donald Trump, called the art of the deal. That is, you negotiate one by one by one. And this is something from my native Argentina, that I was there at some point, and I was having just dinner with a businessman whose business was to do import-export. And I said, how do you do that? For example, if you want to bring an iPhone into Argentina, you have to declare at customs where every subcomponent was manufactured, which is an impossibility. You cannot do that. And yet you walk down the streets of Buenos Aires and everybody has an iPhone. And so you have this disparity. And the reason is that overregulation is an invitation to intermediaries who are government-connected officials to start taking from the society. So in Argentina, you pay somebody called an expediter. There's a standard fee of 10%, and somehow your goods come into the country. Nobody asks questions. Nobody knows where the money goes. It just gets filtered out. And so the corruption became, for me, an insight into what happened when you don't have institutions of constraint. And it's interesting that corruption turns out to be the vulnerability of these regimes. It was the vulnerability of Zuma in South Africa, most spectacularly, but you see the question of corruption emerging. And to just add one more point to that, what's interesting for me is that this is not fancy constitutional law. This is not high democratic theory. It's just ordinary, everyday activity that is accessible by the ordinary prosecutors and the ordinary judiciary.
Well, this leads us nicely. You talked about the background, the conditions which have generated this, both social and economic and also institutional decay, and then the character of the regimes. What do we do? What do you do? Or what do you advise we do? What responses do you think? We have a lot of people talking about responses and a lot of, in a sense, cliched responses, constitutionals, courts, etc. But you have a different take on some of this.
You know, Martin, there's a temptation and almost a demand when you write a book like this that you give your 5-point program at the end. And I tend to be of the Chicago economist school, which two economists see a $20 bill on the street and they decide it can't be there because if it were there, somebody would have picked it up already. And I have the same reaction to, I read these books and there's a 5-point program. I was recently at a program in Washington and somebody came from one of the think tanks and they said, here's our 5-point program to cure this. Reestablish the rule of law, fortify the independence of the judiciary, beef up the workings of the electoral system. And I just wanted to scream at how stupid do you think we are in this room that you think that this is an insight of some kind? And so I have a few insights that don't form a complete package of this, because I think a lot of this is context dependent at a country by country level. But some of the insights have to do with understanding what didn't work. And when I wrote my last big book, Fragile Democracies, a few years back, what seemed to be emerging as the antidote to this kind of incipient elected authoritarianism was constitutional courts and constitutionalism. And in part, this was a reflection of the fact that most of these regimes, their first move when they get into office is to follow Chavez and immediately try to amend the Constitution. As they've gotten more stable in governance and more sophisticated, for the most part, they've abandoned the constitutional project with one exception, that is to get rid of term limits where there are term limits in a particular country. And so, you know, the clear example, which the three of you know very well, is Kaczynski was never able to amend the Constitution, and Orban did, but they are fundamentally similar regimes who have engaged in fundamentally similar types of demagogic, anti-liberal politics through the electoral process. And so I've moved away from the faith in constitutional law and moved more in the direction of buttressing the institutions of ordinary law. And so part of it is that's where the corruption comes in, holding these regimes accountable where I think they're most vulnerable. Part of it is trying to restore institutions that can exist independent of these heads of state. So I give one example. In the United States, we have amended our campaign finance laws, our party funding laws, in such a way that fundamentally debilitated the political parties because we wanted to be pure. We wanted to have less money in politics. All it did was push the money to outside entities, these super PACs and other kinds of non-institutional actors. And the result has been we have more money in the system and weaker institutions. And so the proposal that's most far out in American political discourse that's in this book is let's abolish the campaign limitations. Give as much money as you want, but only to the political parties, not to individual candidates, not to super PACs. Channel it back into the political parties so that the institution can be fortified, and institutions have a different perspective from one separate individual. And just to give you the last point on this, in the 19th century, we created the limited liability corporation. And one of the things that the corporations have is perpetual life. They outlive any one of us. And political parties were the corporations of the political domain. And they have largely dried up. All the traditional political parties, the Gaullists and the socialists, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and country after country, the Congress Party, they've disappeared. They've largely disappeared. And there has to be a way of restoring some kind of organizational expression, institutional expression to democratic politics. So a lot of the smaller reform proposals in here are incremental steps toward that. But it's a very hard task to say, here's 5 points that will bring back functioning democratic politics. When you don't have trade unions, you're not going to have a Labor Party. When you don't have churches that have a following, you're not going to have a Christian Democratic Party. And so you have to reorganize, and that's the scariest part of the current environment.
Can we move then to some questions, first from us and then from the Q&A? It seemed to me that what you've just been saying ties into a concern that I know Adam has with, on the one hand, social and cultural and other sources of problems, and the juxtaposition with purported institutional responses. So Adam, if you could, I don't know if that is your question or if that is your concern, could you unravel it?
It is. Thank you, Sam, for the introduction. I read carefully the book, and I understand the book is focused on the institutions, right? And you rightly said that this institutional perception is not present in the majority of books devoted to the contemporary modern type of populism. But I wonder, it seems to me there's sort of a contradiction inside, because on the one hand, you stress that all those present populist regimes, they receive the democratic legitimacy, right? And then they embark on the hollowing out of the institutions. And the outcome of that is this lack of the institutional constraint. So coming out from populism, it seems to me, is not connected with the development of the formal institutions. The formal institutions are rules plus people. So probably what we should do is to focus on the people, actually, not only on the rules. And I just, it's a rather comment, not a question, but I want to hear your opinion about that. That it seems to me that the point to understand that modern populism and to show the blueprint to get out is connected rather not with only legal institution. You mentioned that you went down from the constitutional law to the ordinary law as a more important, but maybe it's necessary to go even further to the social institutions.
I think it is, but I have less confidence in my own ability to measure how those can be not manipulated, but those can be adjusted. So let me go to the lowest level. In order to engage in democratic politics a century ago, you needed to have a sponsor. somebody had to support you. You needed money from an institution. You needed their cadres to go out and proselytize on your behalf, get votes out on your behalf. You needed to have connections that were beyond you. One of the hardest questions for every country that has a democratic elected system right now is the dislocations caused by social media. So now you have the ability, when Trump won in 2016, it was a body blow to the way we understood politics in the United States. He did not spend money. He was outspent by Hillary Clinton, well outspent by Hillary Clinton. He didn't have an institution that expressed him. He went directly to the people on Twitter. And by going through Twitter, he was able to bypass and to seduce individuals with this. And, you have to give the man his due. He's a very talented exponent of what people are thinking in a very crude, crass way, but he captures the essence of what they're thinking. He would come in 2016 on Twitter and say, this one did that. And he would say, sad. And just the three-letter word, sad, it captured something demeaning and bitter and horrible, but powerful. Hillary Clinton decided to take up Twitter, and her Twitter feed would say, go to my website to see my 72-point program for addressing this. And the contrast between this old style of programmatic appeal that had been the basis of how we structured a party platform, and the word sad, which was so powerful and so evocative, was the contrast between the old and the new. And I don't have a very good feel for how we go back down to that level. So there's some people, Jim Fishkin, Helene Landemore, who believe that that is the road to a new kind of politics. That is, that we need to go back to a certain kind of direct or deliberative democracy in which you break down, you move away from institutions. And there's a lot of proposed reforms of the election system in many countries that would disadvantage parties, but maybe those no longer exist. So in answer to your question or your comment, Adam, I agree that it's at the lower levels where there's this feeling that something has gone deeply wrong, that there is a lack of commitment to the norms of democratic conduct. Here in Australia, you have people who get pulled over by the police for speeding, and they say, I won't roll down the window because I'm a member of the sovereign people, and I don't answer to you. And we have those kind of folks in the United States, and you see this kind of just general anti-society, anti-experts, anti-authority taking hold in a very deep way. I wish I had a simple answer to that, but I'd love to hear your simple answer to how you're going to cure that in Riga.
I want to bring Wojciech into the discussion, but one way of doing that is just to sort of ask a question about the analysis which Adam is confident of and you're concerned about. I came by accident yesterday on a recent book by Larry Bartels, Democracy Erodes from the Top. So quantitative, I can't judge it, except it's a powerful argument. And the argument was that on the basis of 1 million surveys that he discusses, really social attitudes haven't changed much, particularly in Europe he's talking, but he he talks about many countries, and he has, of the usual suspects, for example, Poland and Hungary, a lot of evidence that people weren't voting for extreme. People didn't feel a need for some populist response. leadership was key, and it has to do something that you've said a lot in your book and some today about what they do in power, but these are very distinctive leaders. And I think Wojciech has a question about that. And just to introduce that, my question is really, to what extent do we over-socialize or sociologize a problem which might be actually a problem of a transformation or corruption or something of elites?
Well, there is a strong claim, and Larry Bartels is one of the people who makes it. He does it more empirically, as you said, but the strong claim is that the rise of populism is the betrayal by the elites, and it is not the shifting preferences of the mass of the electorate. I think that this is one of these situations where both are likely true. There has been an abandonment of the elites, but I would put it a little bit differently. First of all, it's a sociological matter. In the United States, we now have the Republican Party being the party of people who have not attended college, and the Democratic Party being the party of people who have graduated college. That's a significant social transformation that can't be explained away by the elites. So I think that the way you framed it, Martin, overstates the thesis on that point. At the same time, there's a wonderful paper by my colleague John Ferrajan and some co-authors, in which they try to assess in Europe, in 5 countries in Europe, what's the primary concern of the voters that's not addressed by the elites. And there is a circumstance. We saw it in Britain with Brexit. We see it in all over Western Europe with the question of immigration, that the political parties do not want to engage the issue of the outsider, the immigrant. And in my book, I'm careful to say that while it's an explosive issue, I think that the immigration question is really the question of economic and social insecurity, the idea that people in our communities don't speak the language we do, things of that sort. And when you have individuals who have these concerns and the parties don't address them, it leaves a political void. That's where the populists come in. So that there is an interaction, obviously, between the elites and the sociology. You can't escape that. But to say, as I think the strong form of the claim, as you put it forward, that it's just the elites who have shifted, misses the realignment of preferences from below.
Wojciech, do you want to follow on this, or something about the character of what populism is doing, or does populists do?
Yeah, so let me first start with the very last point that you raised, Martin, and to which Sam responded, and that is whether we are looking at the elites or whether we are looking at the society, and how does the interaction between the both affect the growth of populism. This is something which has been often presented as a matter of whether we are looking mainly at the demand for populism or at the supply of populism. And one of the scholars who have contributed to it, emphasizing and urging us to look at the demand just as a supply, is Professor Bojan Bugaric, who is one of the participants, as I can see on the list. But on that, I just want to say that literally yesterday, a new report have been published by 2 left-wing eminent Polish sociologists of young generation, Przemysław Sadura and Sławek Sierakowski, about populist society. And I haven't read the report yet, but from what I have heard from radio broadcast on it, it is that they actually survey the state of populist demand in the society as such. So it's probably and again, I don't know Larry Bartel's book, but probably it is almost the opposite to this emphasis on the elites and leadership as opposed to the actually demand from grassroots. And at the end, probably as Sam says, we need to look at both, and it will be very much country specific about which side of the equation we emphasize. But I would like to ask Sam about something that is missing from his book rather than from what is in his book, because as a general thing that will not come as a surprise to him, I actually agree with absolutely everything that he says, and I love each of his pages. I'm very much affected by Sam's scholarship, and I consider myself, as I said at one of the meetings at NYU, an Issacharovian when it comes to the scholarship on populism. I also am mainly interested in the institutions and structures rather than discourses and narratives. But I wonder, Sam, whether you haven't pushed it a little bit too far. And one issue which is absent from your book is precisely that, and that is the specific character of populist narratives, which may be described in various ways, but which usually boil down to paranoia or conspiracy theories or anything like that. David Miliband famously said that there is no authoritarian regime in the world without its own conspiracy theory. And I know all the answers about why we should be more concerned with institutions, because this is also an answer which I give. A, we are lawyers. Let political philosophers such as Nadia Urbinati or Jan Werner Müller deal with the narratives. B, we are mainly interested in populism and its most, as it were, dangerous iteration, which is when it actually rules, as opposed to populism when it only fights for power. And at that time, we are mainly interested in institutional transformations or corruption of the system of democracy rather than what they say. They can say whatever they want when they fight for power, but the reality check comes when they gain power. And yet I must say that to describe populism in a comprehensive way as you do, without any attention being paid to what they say as about what they do, how they rationalize and justify their system, is sort of a little bit surprising. You know, and at one of the meetings in which you took part also at NYU, our friend Madhav Khosla from India said, okay, we should be interested perhaps more, as you, Wojciech, say, in what populists do rather than what they say, but what they say is also meaningful. That is, the words in politics are like deeds, they are acts. So can you explain why you have made this, so to speak, strategic choice in the overall project of your work to put to one side all the stories, narratives, and discourses that populists develop when they embark upon institutional change of democracy?
That's a great question. And I'd like to think it was completely strategic on my part, and because I wanted to highlight the difference, but it's more than that. I don't know that there is more paranoia in politics today than there was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and so forth. At the height of democratic stability in the United States, post-war stability, we had Richard Hofstadter publish a book that made a tremendous influence upon me when I was an undergraduate and read it, The Paranoid Tradition in American Politics. And we have other historians who have chronicled how there has always been sort of a lunatic fringe, paranoia, conspiratorial essence to, now I'm just speaking about the United States, to American society. I mean, one only needs to read some of the narratives of the colonial period, of the Puritan creators of some of the small towns of America and small town democracy in America, to see that that paranoia is there from the beginning. So I can't document how it has gone up or down over time to correlate it with different kinds of forms of institutional stability. So yes, you have this paranoid streak, and it's true everywhere. So that AMLO in Mexico is living out his paranoid fantasy from 2006 today, when he's the elected head of state, by trying to dismantle all the electoral institutions of Mexico. Yes, there's that paranoid streak, but let me flip the inquiry in a certain way. I believe that paranoia is always there. There's always a sense of the outsider who's threatening us. There's always a sense in democratic politics that somebody's doing bad to us. When the institutions hold, the people who get elected tend to get drawn back into the center of political activity. And you can go to horrific figures in the United States when they're young, who become mainstays of more or less conventional politics later on. You can look at Prime Minister Meloni in Italy today. The Italian institutions held relatively well, and she draws toward the center in order to try to govern. You can look at Marine Le Pen, rejecting her own father because the institutions of French democracy were not vulnerable to being overthrown, and so she wants to play for more power. Is she less paranoid than her father was in her politics? Not necessarily. She's just more selective in the sources of paranoid agitation of her base. And so I can't answer your question, Wojciech, about whether this is a driving force or just something that's always present at the periphery and sometimes at the center of democratic politics. It's something that we sort of have to live with, because there's something in the human psyche that it's easier to arouse passion over fear than love.
But sometimes it's easier than other times. And this, in the conference that's coming up, Yanni Verosnai and Amichai Cohen have a piece on post-populist politics. And it's an issue that I know Wojciech also is interested in. And you're clearly very interested in. What do you do when you come in after the populist? If, for example, Kaczynski loses in the next election and Trump, let's hope, also loses, do you have a clean sweep? Are you a different sort of beast? Or is it the case, as they suggest, that whoever comes after a populist is, in a way, I don't know if they use the word, trapped by a range of populist moves that have worked, number one. And secondly, something that I know Wojciech has been concerned with, and maybe he can take the question on more. What do you do if you've got an institution like the Polish Constitutional Court, which has been made over in the image of its manipulator, Kaczynski, and they're still there, and good guys, if that's what they are, come in later? Do they behave? What do they do? And again, with elections, how do you campaign if you've discovered that for a lot of people, the populist style, the paranoid style, is a good style?
And accountability of the former elites.
Sorry, Adam?
Accountability of the former populist elites.
Yeah. Wojciech, do you want to add anything to that? Because you've written on it a good deal.
Well, not really, but maybe I would like to concretize this question with something which is country specific. Sam, among other things, is a great specialist of and originates from Latin America. And we had one huge example of a populist government and sort of wildly, extremely populist, bowing out after the elections and losing elections, and so far not doing anything violent against the election result, even though he tried. So what is your analysis, Sam, of the case of Brazil? Does it teach us, people who are concerned about populists in other countries, about what are the conditions, what are the factors which allow non-populists, and for the sake of argument, let's take it that Lula is not a populist, at least of this sort of toxic kind, as Bolsonaro was, to win. Brazil presented itself with some very special characteristics, but it's a huge country. We may learn something from it. Is it something about its judiciary, which miraculously maintained its independence throughout? Is it because the army was so, in the end, neutral? It is the fault of Bolsonaro himself. Is it COVID that killed his chances? I mean, can we, following up on what Martin said, what will be post-populist politics, what lessons can we draw from that one country? Well, we have some other cases of non-populists winning. Marcos Jr. is certainly not as populist as Duterte was. And can we learn something also from the Philippines case? But then we have negative cases. We have Hungary, where Orban was re-elected for the third time, and we have Israel, when after a very short period of non-populist government, Netanyahu returned. And we have two countries. We have Turkey, of course, on the negative side. We have two countries awaiting the outcome of next elections. That is Poland and India. So we have a very mixed bag. We have the landscape of post-populism or populists presenting themselves for re-election is very mixed. I'm particularly interested in the conclusions and lessons you draw from Brazil.
Okay, so let me take the questions in sort of reverse order and sequence. First of all, the most significant election in Latin America right now is one that probably people outside Latin America won't pay attention to, but it's in El Salvador. Bukele is the dominant figure in Latin America right now. All election politics, whether you're in Argentina, whether you're in Chile, are going to turn around the Bukele model, which is basically Duterte brought to South America. It is a populist, anti-institutional, anti-legal constraints, violent against drug dealers and petty thugs. And at least in El Salvador, it is wildly popular because it has restored a measure of order that could not be established before. That's the real threat right now. So the question is, what does politics look like post-populism? If you want to be elected in Latin America right now, you have to start addressing the questions of crime, and you have to show some capacity for improving people's lives. Now, one of the hard questions is populists have a very short-term time horizon. So in my book, I talk about the propensity of populist regimes to just basically spend. They print money, they spend it, they pay off their supporters. There's a corruption not only in lining their own pockets, there's an inducement to a sweet tooth. There's an inducement toward sugar highs for the population as a whole. And so we see in places like the United States, you have Trump voted out, you have Biden coming in, And he has to show that he can deliver on a short-term basis, because now we're going to build infrastructure over the next 30 years is not a viable political program anymore. Unfortunately, this takes the form of executive unilateral action, of eliminating the debt on student loans, trillions of dollars given away by executive fiat until stopped by the courts and Congress. That's the danger of where politics goes. Now, how did Brazil come about? It's a variety of ways. First of all, with a few exceptions, most of these populists are terrible heads of state. They cannot control the economy. They lead to, the kind of Argentinianization of the economies of all these countries, massive inflation, economic dislocation. And so you have some vulnerability there because they tend not to deliver. And sometimes it's a cataclysmic effect. You mentioned COVID, obviously the earthquakes in Turkey. These are things that challenge regime capability and expose these regimes as not as capable as one would have thought. In sort of a less dramatic way, the Ukraine war exposing the vulnerabilities of Putin militarily, which is something that none of us, I think, expected. But what happened in Brazil was Bolsonaro was highly incompetent, highly unable to address critical issues such as COVID, such as crime, such as a whole range of things. And the institutions in Brazil held, and that's the key thing. So what were the institutions that held? Brazil has a very good judiciary. It is one of the real conquests of the transition to democracy. The judiciary is highly professional. It is well compensated. It has had relatively few corruption scandals within the judiciary. It is a strong institution. The judiciary runs the electoral system. Bolsonaro, like Trump, said fake news, election fraud, they're going to steal the election, all this. The head of the electoral court, will likely be the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Constitutional Court, but who is acting by delegation to the electoral court. This is a system that's used in many Latin American countries. He did something absolutely extraordinary. When Bolsonaro began to challenge the potential election fraud that was going to steal his votes, he invited the military in to audit the election system before and after. And so the military was drawn in, and they are not all ardent Democrats, but they got drawn in and they gave their imprimatur ahead of time, and afterwards they were lukewarmishly endorsing of the election results. That took away any social basis for Bolsonaro to challenge, in the same way that Trump was dependent in the United States on these fictitious legal challenges, and the judiciary basically held as an institution. In every single case, they rejected the claims there. So the answer, I think, is you buttress the institutions and you do what you can to protect them. And the threat is that if these people stay too long in office, they will unwind the institutions. Trump did much more damage in 4 years than I thought was possible. If he is reelected next year, I truly fear for the capacity of the United States to withstand another 4 years. And that's a country with very strong democratic institutions. When you're talking about the newer democracies of Eastern Europe, the vulnerabilities are much greater there.
I'm conscious of time because I want to open for questions, and so I ask whether perhaps you could compress an answer to a question that I think I can't leave out, which is, since you mentioned Trump, one of the strongest themes, not strongest, but underlying themes of your suggestions of what to do now is not to go after populist leaders, successors, not to go after former populist leaders for things they did in execution of their duties, even if these were very bad things, but perhaps to go after them for things they did, in a sense, in a private capacity, their various corruptions. And I just would ask for a short comment on how you rate the various prosecutions that Trump is now facing by your scorecard or your suggestion.
So my general view, Martin, is that democracies that prosecute their former heads of state tend to be ex-democracies, because if you follow Adam Jaworski and that approach, it's the capacity to achieve rotation in office that defines a democracy. You start jailing your former heads of state, they don't leave office, right? So that you have the compromise of a major aspect. But it doesn't mean that you can let them get away with anything. And so you look around the world and you see, where have heads of state been successfully prosecuted once they've left office? And you see there was a prosecution of Sarkozy. You see that there were prosecutions of individuals in various countries for things that are well-established criminal offenses. So the key is that they have to be crimes that would be crimes if committed by anyone, and they have to be an application that is absolutely obvious to the ordinary population, even if they don't all accept it. So the prosecution in New York was for an offense that had never been prosecuted in the state prosecution. An offense had never been prosecuted in this fashion before, and it made Trump look like a victim. The prosecution for the documents under the Espionage Act is something that we've prosecuted people for before. There's a chance to return them on his part. There was a chance. He denied them. And so I've come up with sort of a four-part test that it has to be for something that was recognized to be a crime before the individual came along. It had to be something of sufficient significance and not a bureaucratic miscalculation. So it's not, you didn't file the right forms for the various things. It has to be of such obvious importance that you make a prima facie case among the population, and it has to be proportionate to what the offense is. It can't be a technical "we got you." Right. All of those point away from any use of the criminal law for things that were done while in office, because it's too hard to disentangle the activities in office from criminal, the specifics of this person having been head of state, which means, unfortunately, it's very difficult to see a successful prosecution of Trump for January 6th. Whereas the things he did after January 6th, or the things he did as a candidate, trying to overturn, to manufacture fabricated votes, that's something that looks more like routine fraud. And that's why I think the more it looks like ordinary law, the more powerful it is.
Okay. Well, this is wonderful. And we could obviously just go on, and we will, in fact, but in a different format, because we have three questions on our chat, and we have an audience that I'd like to hear from too. So, Carolyn, can you guide us in dealing with Q&A? Thank you.
Yes, we have one question. from, sorry, I'm just trying to read quickly. George Allen would like to know, are you, Samuel, implying that we should support or rebuild the deep state? Where would you start? What would the draft be?
Since the deep state is always used as a pejorative, let me say categorically that I'm opposed to bad things. And so I don't endorse the deep state. But I think the question is actually a subtle one about what are the range of institutions that have to be made functional. And this gets a little bit to the question about how do you deal with the paranoid streak in populist governance. It is one of the extraordinary things in the United States today that the Republican Party, the wing of the Republican Party that's most captured by Donald Trump, wants to disband the FBI, wants to destroy the Internal Revenue Service, wants to demolish the CIA. This was once the clarion call of the paranoid left. And now all of a sudden it has moved into the right wing. So the left in the United States talks about abolishing the police, which is an electoral death knell for them. And the right wants to abolish the FBI and the CIA and every governmental institution they associate with the deep state. The hard thing for me is that I think that one of the great failings of democratic states is that we've lost a great deal of governmental competence, state competence. And so you do need these institutions to be built back up. And in part, these are police and military institutions that can provide for security. Otherwise, you're inviting the Bukeles of the world to come forward and occupy that space. So I don't want to be an advocate for the deep state, but I do want to be an advocate for the state in the first instance has to provide for the security of its population economically and in terms of physical security. This is not, I wish I had invented that, but I think there was a guy named Tom Hobbs some years back who got to it first.
Samuel, Pinar from Turkey was wondering whether you thought that social institutions and a cultural dimension to some of that might be influential in following up on that earlier question.
I think Turkey is a great example of two kinds of institutions that are important. Turkey just had an election in which Erdogan won on the second round, and he won narrowly. Now, Erdogan's been in pretty complete power for a long time. And the fact that he was at risk electorally is a tribute to one kind of institution, and that is for whatever reason, the electoral institutions of Turkey have maintained their integrity and their independence and were able to run an election. So the opposition conceded without any hint that the election was manipulated. The election was unfair because they were in prison, their newspapers were shut down, but it was not manipulated on election day in the electoral process. So that's one kind of institution. But the most important institutions in withstanding the anti-liberal, anti-democratic impulses of populism are universities, the media, to the extent that our older conception of media still has presence, and it has to be the cultural institutions. In some countries, the church has played a very good role in resisting some of the worst populist impulses. In many countries right now, the church is either the old established churches are either completely weak or compromised by association with prior very dangerous regimes. But those are the institutions, and in older days, we would have looked to trade unions, but trade unions tend to be extremely weak in almost every country right now. In older days, we would have looked to other kinds of civic associations. And the difficulty is that those are being largely displaced by social media, and we have not seen how that contributes to a collective sense of solidarity that can resist some of these impulses.
Thanks,
We
Samuel.
had a moment where we thought the Tahrir Square moment, where everybody was going to get together on Facebook and we were going to have popular resistance. And then it turns out one of the reasons we love Tahrir Square so much is that there were beautiful young people in one place in Cairo so that CNN could film them, and they were wearing blue jeans and carrying iPhones, and we all felt, oh yes, that is our world, except that wasn't Egyptian society.
Indeed. I'm just going to bring Boyan into the conversation for his question. It'll just take a second for it to...
Boyan Bukaric from the University of Sheffield, before that from University of Ljubljana.
Yeah. Wait 1 second. Oh, here we go.
Oh, you're really bringing him in. Wonderful.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we have the technology, Samuel.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Isacharov. I read this book almost immediately after it was published. I tremendously enjoyed the book. Part of the reason was that I was just writing a new book with Mark Tushnet, and we just wanted to see, what the big constitutional names are telling us about solutions to, authoritarian populism. And as Professor Isacharov mentioned earlier, he really didn't like those kinds of works with bullet points in the end. And unfortunately, in his case, the publisher, Oxford, before the book was published, promised exactly that. But I was very much pleased to not to see that in the book. So that was kind of my story about the encounter of the book. But here are my two short...
Ask for your money back.
No. So here are my two short questions. So the first one, I really enjoyed your intro part, a very, very rich and sophisticated narrative of socioeconomic changes around the world, which brought forward these populist waves. And then in the end, I was a little bit surprised not to see sort of that being matched by the second part, where you concentrate mostly on institutions, parties, and other things. And I totally understand that, as a constitutional lawyers, one easy question would be, well, we are not political economists, so so let's leave that for political economists. But I thought that there must be a reason why you spend so much time giving us this very rich political economy detail in the beginning. So maybe if you can explain why not, then didn't say much about that in the second part of the book. And the second question would be about your claim about the novelty of these regimes. We heard this story from several different authors, different angles, telling this narrative. It's not tanks on the street. It's not, putsch. It's not, force. It's, the autocratic legalism. It's the use of law in order to subvert democracy and so on and so on. But more than I read history in some older accounts, maybe not necessarily so similar, I see that we have seen that before. For example, just a quick American example, a US example. For another purpose, I was reading the account of the conflict between FDR and American Liberty Union in the 1936 election. It was pretty very much similar to what we're reading today. FDR, for me, was an early historic example of a specific populist. I would count him among the progressive populists. But his attack, he loathed American Liberty League. The nature of the conflict was all or nothing. So basically, it was the war for absolute war for the who wins the war on the conceptions, on the category. So it was not about the compromise. Oh, let's have the elections and then we'll discuss about the tax rates or things like that. So finally, I think that maybe perhaps all of us, who think and write about these things, maybe we are focused maybe on too short time horizon. Because here's just an idea. I was reading recently this book by Jack Balkin about the constitutional cycles. It's one of very few books who forces us to think about, like in a kind of a longer term. So maybe just a provocation. So I think that what we are seeing is kind of a Gramscian interregnum, or or Hirschman's, shifting involvement. These big shifts in time when we are seeing the old is dying, the new is not really emerging, but in the populists are very skillful in using this opportunity to come to the surface. But we don't know yet what will come out, in the 5, 10, 15 years. Thank you.
Wow. So let me try to quickly respond. You're absolutely right, and you've tweeted about this, and so I kind of suspected it was coming. But you're absolutely right that the early focus is on the socioeconomics, and I give a very why 2008 was such a critical moment, because it looked like the whole economic system was collapsing. We saved the banks, but we didn't save working people. And the conclusions at the end are much more tentative, as you say, on how you gain back the economic confidence of the working population. It's implicit in some of the things I propose, some of the things about restoring state activity to get the economy going, things of that sort. But you're right, I don't address Gini coefficients, I don't address distribution of wealth in particular. One of the reasons is that there's such a commonality to this populist surge in democratic countries that seems to be independent of the level of inequality in any particular one of these countries. There's no correlation that I have seen between the Gini coefficient on the one hand and the likelihood that you have this populist surge. And in fact, oddly, many of these populist movements gravitate toward massively wealthy individuals to be the leaders of the movements. And so I'm a little bit less concerned with the standard critique about income inequality than I am with concerns about state competence and the state capacity to provide economic security, which may be related to the levels of inequality, but it's not a linear correlation between the two. I think that the last point you made about we're at the time of a shift is absolutely what I fear. And I think that I probably agree with that. I don't think, and one of the reasons that my bullet points are not there and that my conclusions on this are tentative is I don't think we're going back to the way democracy was organized in the 19th and 20th century. I don't think we're going back to organic political parties that grow out of mass institutions, because those mass institutions themselves are not there. And so I think that we're going to get a reorganization of democratic politics. I don't want it to be in this fundamentally hostile anti-liberal form. I don't want it to be strongman rule with a plebiscite-like election every 4 years or 6 years. I don't know what the next organization of democratic politics is going to look like. What I offer, and you're entirely right to criticize it as insufficient, but what I offer is a temporizing strategy to buttress the institutions that exist so that they address the concerns of ordinary working people and so that they better function at delivering social goods. Now, the problem is that the post-populist politics are colored by what came before. So Lula better deliver quickly in Brazil, and I don't know that he has the capability to do that. Biden's under tremendous pressure to show real turnaround, and he's unable to sell it because he doesn't have that kind of get on the stump character that Trump had. Some of the regimes are slightly better at managing their economies and delivering for the citizens. I think that Poland is an example of that. But most are not. And I think one hopes that the democratic politics will still be there. I suspect you won't be satisfied with that, but that's where I ended up in this.
Well, thank you. We have one more question on the Q&A, and I think that will likely be our last question because we've now very swiftly gone through an hour and a half. So Carolyn, could you transmit that?
Yes, it follows on somewhat from what Boyan was asking about, where Beatrice is interested in, is part of the answer to improve funding for political parties and somewhat bolster political party competition in fragile democracies, and she's focused particularly on Eastern Europe. But we want to do that without making political careers, a way to make quick money or sort of bolstering the disingenuous reasons that people come into politics. So if funding was part of the answer, is there a commensurate risk that by introducing some sort of funding model, the landscape might actually be more volatile in an unhelpful way?
Unfortunately, that's true. There's a paradox. In fact, we just had a constitutional process in Chile in which a very left-wing constitutional effort was made that basically would have carved out political parties altogether. And the problem is that the political parties are viewed favorably in public opinion polls there by 3% of the population. So when you have an attempt to buttress them, it sounds odd, it sounds off to what the people want. When you talk about, in some countries, going from a single chamber legislature to bicameral legislature, oftentimes the popular response is, what, we're going to pay for twice as many of those people? There is a hatred of professional politicians. Some of it is well justified. Some of it, unfortunately, is a cause and effect that's all leading in a spiral. And yes, I think that we need to buttress institutions, including political parties. The difficulty is that when they are buttressed by simply state funding, then they become just another organ of a bureaucracy that's disengaged from the population, and they're perceived as such. So the mainstream European parties have over the years lost their mass base, and they live by government subsidies. And this is a point, Peter Mayer wrote a wonderful book 10, 12 years ago on the hollowing out of European politics. And so you have this fictional election activity by parties that are largely just paid state bureaucrats. Meanwhile, all the decisions are made in Brussels. And so you have a politics that's divorced both from engagement with people and with the consequences of political decisions. If you go back in time, and I think in Finland you still have this, but most European countries you don't, there used to be a time when the political parties organized football teams, sports leagues, they organized local symphonies, they organized choirs, they had a local newspaper, they had summer camps for the kids, and they were the center of social life. And out of that grew the political wing of it, and it had an organic quality to it. You can't just pump money into them and expect that that's going to be recreated. That's the hard part of figuring out what the future of democratic politics will look like.
Well, unfortunately, and it really is unfortunate, I think we have to stop here because there's so much more that I'd like to have heard from you. and from the audience, but we can't do that. So first I want to thank our panel, our audience, Carolyn, who makes everything happen, and Sam, most of all of our, because it's a principle of selection, all of the people we invite are very clever, but some are also very wise and reflective, and we can't tell ahead of time whether we've lucked in or not, but this has been really a rich, rewarding, and for me, hugely instructive discussion, quite apart from the book, which was already a way into all of that. So I'm very grateful to you, grateful for everybody who's listening. Remember, in due course, the podcast will be edited and it will be available in globalcompop.blog and on YouTube, and we'll tell everybody who was signed up when that happens. And thank you very, very much again. And I'm very glad I'm going to be seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.